Some children learned that the world can be cruel before they even understand what kindness looks like. 10-year-old Molly knew this truth better than most, standing in the dusty streets of Dry Creek with hunger gnawing at her small belly. The townsfolk made sport of her desperation. When she asked for food, they laughed. When she begged for work, they turned away. She was just another orphan in a town that had no patience for the weak. But on this day, everything changed. A massive shadow fell across her path. Heavy boots approached with slow, deliberate steps. The laughter stopped. When Molly looked up, she saw him, a giant of a man they called Ox. What would this silent cowboy do that would shake the entire town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Dry Creek sat like a weathered scab on the vast expanse of Montana Territory, its buildings bleached by relentless sun and scoured by winds that carried the promise of nothing but more hardship. Main Street stretched barely 3 blocks, lined with false-fronted establishments that had seen better days before most folks could remember. The general store's paint peeled in long strips, curling like dying leaves. The saloon's batwing doors hung askew on rusted hinges. Even the church steeple leaned slightly eastward, as if the whole town was slowly surrendering to the prevailing winds. It was 1887, and prosperity had never quite found its way to Dry Creek. The railroad had passed them by 2 years prior, choosing a route 20 miles south that left the town to wither like an unwatered plant. Cattle drives that once brought brief moments of wealth now took different trails. What remained were the stubborn, the desperate, and those with nowhere else to go. Molly had become part of that last category 3 months ago, when the fever took both her parents within a week of each other. At 10 years old, she understood death well enough, but the loneliness that followed was a lesson no child should have to learn. Her father had been the town's blacksmith, a good man who extended credit too often and collected payment too rarely. When he died, his debts died with him, but so did any claim Molly might have had to the small house behind the forge. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, had taken her in for exactly 12 days. 12 days of sleeping in a musty storage room and eating table scraps while enduring lectures about Christian charity and the burden of caring for waifs. On the 13th morning, Molly woke to find her few belongings packed in a flour sack and placed outside the kitchen door with a note explaining that the Henderson household could no longer accommodate her needs. Since then, she had survived on whatever kindness could be scrounged from a town that had little to spare. She slept in the church basement when Pastor Williams wasn't looking, or in the stable behind Turner's boarding house when the weather turned cold. During the day, she made herself useful where she could, sweeping storefronts for a penny, carrying water for the laundry woman, or simply standing with her small hand extended, hoping someone might drop a coin or crust of bread. The people of Dry Creek had developed a peculiar relationship with Molly's suffering. They weren't actively cruel, most of them, but they weren't particularly kind either. She had become part of the landscape, like the hitching posts or the water trough, something they saw every day without really seeing at all. When she approached the mercantile, Mrs. Garrett would shoo her away from the front door, but leave day-old bread on the back step. When she lingered near the restaurant, the proprietor would grumble loudly about vagrants while ensuring she could see him scraping leftovers into a tin that somehow found its way to the alley. But there were others, those who found entertainment in her desperation. Young men who would toss pennies just out of her reach and laugh when she scrambled in the dust. Women who would promise work in exchange for help, only to send her away empty-handed once the task was done. Children her own age, who had learned cruelty from their elders and practiced it with the thoughtless efficiency of youth. Into this harsh tableau had walked a stranger 6 weeks ago, a man so large he seemed to bend the very light around him. He rode into town on a horse that looked small beneath his bulk, leading a pack animal loaded with supplies. Everything about him was oversized, his hands, his shoulders, the shadow he cast. But it was his silence that truly set him apart. in a place where men measured themselves by the volume of their voices and the boldness of their claims. Here was someone who spoke only when necessary, and then in words carefully chosen. They called him Ox, though no one knew his real name. He had rented a room at Turner's boarding house, paying a month in advance with silver dollars that rang true when dropped on the wooden counter. He took his meals at the restaurant, always sitting at the same corner table where he could see both the street and the room's other occupants. He drank coffee, never whiskey, and left exact change for whatever he ordered. In 6 weeks, he had spoken perhaps 50 words to the townspeople. When Turner asked about his business in Dry Creek, Ox had simply said, "Passing through." When Sheriff Morrison inquired about his previous whereabouts, the big man had replied, "South." When curious locals pressed for more information, they met only silence and a gaze that suggested further questions would be unwelcome. Yet for all his reticence, Ox was not unfriendly. He stepped aside when ladies passed on the wooden sidewalks. He touched his hat brim in acknowledgement when greeted. He helped when Murphy's wagon got stuck in the mud after a rare rainstorm, using his considerable strength to free the wheels without being asked and refusing payment for the assistance. The mystery of his presence had become a source of endless speculation. Some thought he was a bounty hunter, others a cattle buyer scouting for spring purchases. A few whispered he might be running from something or someone. His clothes were well made but worn, suggesting a man who had means but lived simply. His horse bore no brand that anyone recognized. The pack animal carried what appeared to be camping gear and supplies, but also a few items that sparked curiosity: books wrapped in oilcloth, a wooden box that might contain instruments, and always, the bulge of a weapon worn beneath his long coat. What the townspeople couldn't know, and what Ox himself barely acknowledged, was that he had been watching Molly from the moment he arrived. Not with any particular intent, but with the recognition that comes when one damaged soul recognizes another. He had seen how she moved through the town like a ghost, present but unseen. He had witnessed the small cruelties and casual indifference that marked her days. And he had felt something stir in his chest that he thought had died long ago, a protective instinct that had once been the defining characteristic of his life. In his room at night, Ox would take out a silver pocket watch, its surface worn smooth by countless opening and closing. Inside was a photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a small boy with an infectious grin. He would study their faces by lamplight, remembering their voices, their laughter, the way they had made his life complete. They had been taken from him by men who understood only greed and violence, men who saw kindness as weakness and love as something to be exploited. For 3 years, he had carried their memory and his rage across the territories, seeking justice that always seemed to slip just beyond his grasp. He had become a hard man, a dangerous man, someone who had forgotten that the world could hold anything besides cruelty and loss. But watching Molly navigate her daily survival with a dignity that belied her circumstances had begun to crack something inside him that he thought had hardened beyond repair. The pocket watch had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that. It kept perfect time, marking the hours and minutes and seconds since he had last held his family alive. But lately, when he looked at its face, he found himself thinking not of time lost, but of time remaining, and of a small girl who deserved better than what the world had given her so far. On this particular afternoon, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon and the first drops of rain began to darken the dusty street, Ox sat at his usual table in the restaurant, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Through the window he could see Molly making her rounds, approaching each establishment with diminishing hope as the day wore on, and her luck continued to run thin. He watched her hesitate outside the saloon, gathering courage for what everyone knew would be another humiliation. The men inside were already laughing, already preparing their cruel entertainment. And something in Ox, something that had been building for 6 weeks of silent observation, finally reached its breaking point. He stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet room. Every eye turned toward him as he moved toward the door, his heavy boots marking time like a funeral dirge. Outside, the laughter was growing louder, more vicious. It was time for the silence to end. The saloon doors swung open with their familiar creak, releasing a cloud of tobacco smoke and stale beer into the afternoon air. Molly stood on the threshold, her bare feet pale against the dark wood of the porch, clutching the worn fabric of her dress with small, trembling fingers. The laughter inside had already begun, that particular brand of cruel amusement that grown men reserved for those who could not fight back. "Well, look what the wind blew in," called out Jimmy Fletcher, a ranch hand whose cruelty seemed to expand in direct proportion to his audience. "Little orphan Molly, come begging again." The other men turned from their cards and drinks, their faces lighting up with the anticipation of sport. There were 5 of them clustered around a table near the window, their clothes dusty from a day's work, but their spirits high from an afternoon's drinking. These were not evil men, not in the way that truly wicked people are evil. But they were bored and looking for entertainment, and a hungry child asking for scraps provided just the right amount of harmless cruelty to brighten their day. I was wondering," Molly began, her voice barely above a whisper, "if maybe there were any what?" Interrupted Buck Morrison, the sheriff's lazy son who had never worked an honest day in his 22 years. "Any what, little mouse? Speak up so we can all hear you." Molly's cheeks burned with shame, but hunger was a more powerful force than embarrassment. "Any leftover food?" she managed, the words falling from her lips like stones. "I could work for it. I could sweep or—" The laughter erupted like a gunshot, sharp and sudden and designed to wound. Jimmy Fletcher slapped his knee with exaggerated mirth. "Work for it! Did you hear that, boys? She wants to work for it. What kind of work you think a scrawny little thing like her could do?" "Mike could chase the rats out of the storage room," suggested Tom Bradley, a man whose belly suggested he had never missed a meal in his life. "Though I reckon the rats are bigger than she is." More laughter, louder now, drawing the attention of other patrons. Even Jake Turner, who owned the boarding house and usually kept to himself, looked up from his whiskey with amusement. The bartender, Pete Hawkins, continued wiping glasses with mechanical precision, but Molly could see the smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Tell you what, little orphan," Jimmy Fletcher continued, his voice taking on a mock-serious tone that made the other men lean forward with anticipation. "You get down on your hands and knees right there on the floor and bark like a dog 3 times. Do that, and maybe we'll find you something to eat." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Molly's face went white, then red, then white again. She had endured many humiliations in her short life, but this felt different somehow, more deliberate, more designed to strip away the last vestiges of her dignity. "Come on now," Buck Morrison chimed in, warming to the game. "Don't be shy. Just a little bark. Woof, woof, woof. That's all we want to hear." "Maybe she's forgotten how," Tom Bradley added with a grin. "Been so long since she's had a decent meal. She's probably forgotten she's not a dog already." The laughter that followed this observation was the kind that leaves wounds, not on the body, but somewhere deeper where scars form that never fully heal. Molly stood frozen in the doorway, caught between hunger and humiliation, between need and the last precious fragments of her self-respect. Outside, the first real drops of rain had begun to fall, pattering against the wooden sidewalk with increasing intensity. The sky had darkened to the color of old pewter, and thunder rumbled in the distance like a warning of things to come. But inside the saloon, the men were oblivious to the changing weather, focused entirely on their entertainment. "What's the matter, little mouse?" Jimmy Fletcher pressed, his voice taking on an edge that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you think you're too good for us working folks." It was then that Molly made her mistake, if it could be called a mistake. She straightened her thin shoulders, lifted her chin, and looked Jimmy Fletcher directly in the eye. "I'm not a dog," she said quietly, but with a firmness that surprised everyone in the room, including herself, The silence that followed was different from the expectant quiet that had preceded the laughter. This was the silence of men who had been challenged by someone they considered beneath challenge, who had been reminded of their own humanity by someone they had chosen to see as less than human. Jimmy Fletcher's face darkened. "Not a dog," he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Well, ain't you the proud little princess? Too proud to work for a meal, too proud to do what you're told." He stood up from his chair, swaying slightly from the whiskey, but steady enough to be intimidating. "Maybe we should teach you some manners about knowing your place." It was at this moment, with Jimmy Fletcher rising from his chair and the other men beginning to murmur their approval, with Molly backing toward the door and the first real fear beginning to show in her eyes, that the shadow fell across the saloon floor. The shadow was impossible to ignore, stretching from the doorway nearly to the bar itself. It seemed to swallow the light, to make the lanterns flicker and the late afternoon sun dim to nothing. Every man in the saloon turned toward the entrance, and the laughter died as suddenly as if someone had thrown a blanket over a fire. Ox stood in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space so completely that he seemed less like a man and more like a force of nature. The rain had begun in earnest now, and droplets clung to his coat and hat like jewels. His face was impassive, but his eyes held something that made even drunk men reconsider their next words. He said nothing. He simply stood there, taking in the scene with the measured gaze of someone accustomed to reading situations quickly and accurately. Jimmy Fletcher, still on his feet but suddenly uncertain, looked from Ox to Molly and back again. "This ain't your business, stranger," Fletcher said. But there was none of the bravado that had marked his treatment of the child. "Just having a little fun with the local beggar girl." Ox's gaze moved to Molly, who stood pressed against the wall near the window, her eyes wide with something between hope and terror. For a long moment he studied her, this small, fierce creature who had refused to bark like a dog despite her desperate hunger. Then he looked back at Jimmy Fletcher and the other men, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Fun's over." 2 words, that was all. But they fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread to every corner. Jimmy Fletcher opened his mouth to object, to assert his right to entertainment, to remind this stranger about minding his own business. But something in Ox's expression, not anger exactly, but something far more dangerous than anger, made the words die in his throat. Ox stepped aside, clearing the doorway, and gestured toward Molly with a movement so gentle it seemed impossible from hands that large. "Come," he said, and his voice was softer now, meant for her alone. Molly hesitated. She had learned to be wary of kindness, particularly from strangers, particularly from men. But something in his eyes, something that spoke of understanding, of recognition, made her take a tentative step forward. "Now hold on just a minute," Buck Morrison said, finding his courage in the presence of his friends. "You can't just walk in here and—" Ox turned his head toward Morrison with the deliberate slowness of a man who was giving fair warning. The sheriff's son, despite his 22 years and his family connections, found himself suddenly interested in the bottom of his whiskey glass. Molly took another step, then another. As she drew closer to the giant man in the doorway, she could see details that hadn't been visible from across the room. His coat was well made but worn at the edges. His boots were expensive leather, carefully maintained but showing signs of long travel. And his hands, those enormous hands that had looked so threatening from a distance, were held open and relaxed, positioned where she could see them clearly. When she reached the doorway, Ox stepped back to give her room, and she found herself standing beside him on the covered porch. The rain was falling steadily now, creating a curtain between them and the street, but also providing a kind of shelter, a private space where the two of them stood alone. "You hungry?" Ox asked, and his voice was so gentle that Molly felt tears spring to her eyes. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Ox reached into his coat and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it carefully, revealing bread and cheese and dried meat. Simple food, but more than Molly had seen in days. He handed it to her without ceremony, watching as she accepted it with trembling hands. "Eat," he said. And as Molly took her first bite of food freely given without humiliation or cost, Ox spoke the 7 words that would change both their lives forever. "Come eat with me, little one." The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. It was not the silence of men shocked into speechlessness or of a child too frightened to respond. It was the silence of a moment when the world shifts on its axis, when lives change direction, when the course of things is altered in ways that will ripple forward through time. Inside the saloon, Jimmy Fletcher and his friends exchanged uncertain glances. Outside, under the shelter of the porch, a giant of a man and a slip of a girl stood in the rain, sharing food and something far more precious, the beginning of trust. The rain continued its steady drumming on the porch roof as Molly finished the last crumb of bread, her small hands cupped protectively around the food, as if someone might try to take it away. Ox waited patiently, his massive presence somehow comforting rather than threatening, like standing in the shade of a sturdy oak during a summer storm. "There's more," he said quietly when she was done, noting how she licked her fingers to catch every morsel. "Proper meal. Hot food." Molly looked up at him with eyes that held a lifetime of disappointment. Adults had made promises before. Promises of work, of kindness, of help that never materialized. She had learned to expect nothing, to hope for little, to be grateful for scraps. But something in this man's voice, some quality she couldn't name, made her want to believe him. "Why?" she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of all her confusion and wariness. Ox was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one was being carefully chosen. "Sometimes a person gets hungry for more than food," he said finally. "Sometimes they get hungry for doing something right." It wasn't really an answer, at least not one that explained anything concrete. But it was honest in a way that made Molly nod, as if she understood something beyond the words themselves. "Come on then," Ox said, stepping down from the porch into the rain. "Let's get you somewhere warm and dry." They walked together down Main Street, an odd pair that drew stares from the few people brave enough to venture out in the downpour. Ox's long stride was carefully shortened to match Molly's smaller steps, and when she stumbled on the uneven wooden sidewalk, his hand was there to steady her, gentle despite its size. Warm despite the cool rain, Turner's boarding house sat at the end of the street, a 2-story structure that had once been painted white, but had faded to the color of old bones. Jake Turner, the proprietor, was sweeping the front porch when they approached, his movements mechanical and efficient. He was a thin man with nervous energy, someone who found comfort in routine and order. "Afternoon, Mr. Ox," Turner said, pausing in his sweeping to tip his hat. His eyes flicked to Molly with curiosity but no hostility. "Nasty weather we're having." "Need to feed the child," Ox replied, his words as economical as always. "Proper meal." "Hot food." Turner's eyebrows rose slightly. He had been running the boarding house for 15 years and had seen all manner of strange requests, but this was unusual, even by frontier standards. A man of Ox's apparent means, taking interest in a local orphan, was the kind of thing that would set tongues wagging throughout the town. "Well, I suppose," Turner began, but Ox was already reaching into his coat, withdrawing a handful of silver coins that caught what little light filtered through the grey afternoon. "Pay for a week," Ox said, placing the money in Turner's palm. 3 meals a day. Clean room." Turner looked down at the coins, then up at Ox's impassive face, then over at Molly, who was standing very still, as if afraid that breathing too loudly might break whatever spell was keeping this kindness intact. "A week," Turner repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "To start," Ox clarified, and something in his tone suggested that the arrangement might extend considerably longer than 7 days. Turner pocketed the coins, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned not to question good fortune when it presented itself. "Well then," he said, opening the front door and gesturing them inside. "Let's get you folks out of this weather." The interior of the boarding house was simple but clean, with the dining room that held 6 tables and a kitchen that smelled of coffee and fresh bread. Mrs. Turner, Jake's wife, appeared from behind the kitchen door at the sound of voices, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She was a motherly woman in her 50s who had raised 3 children of her own and had developed the practical kindness that comes from years of caring for others. "This is Miss Molly," Ox announced without preamble. "She'll be staying with you for a while. Needs feeding up and looking after." Mrs. Turner took in the sight of the soaked, thin child standing beside the imposing stranger, and her maternal instincts engaged immediately. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, hurrying forward. "Look at you, drenched to the bone. Come here, child, let's get you warm and dry." She bustled around Molly like a concerned hen, feeling her forehead for fever, clucking disapprovingly at her wet clothes, already planning what needed to be done. "Jake, start the fire in room 3 and put the kettle on for tea. This child needs warming up from the inside out." As the Turners hurried to make preparations, Molly found herself standing alone with Ox in the dining room, overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of her circumstances. An hour ago, she'd been begging for scraps and facing humiliation. Now she was being promised hot meals and a clean bed, and she couldn't quite make her mind accept the reality of it. "Is this real?" she asked in a small voice, looking up at the giant man who had so completely altered her world. Ox knelt down so that his face was level with hers, a gesture that required considerable effort given his size, but which brought them into a more equal conversation. Up close, she could see that his eyes were dark brown, almost black but warm, with an expression she hadn't expected, kindness mixed with something that looked like old sorrow. "Real as anything gets," he said quietly. "But there's rules that come with it," Molly tensed, waiting for the conditions that would make this kindness conditional, that would turn it into another form of transaction where her dignity was the currency expected in payment. "First rule," Ox continued, "you eat every meal they put in front of you. No arguing, no saying you're not hungry when you are. Your body's been through enough. It needs proper fuel to heal." She nodded, this making perfect sense. "Second rule, you let Mrs. Turner help you get cleaned up and into proper clothes. She's got a good heart and she knows what she's doing." Again, Molly nodded. She had dreamed of being truly clean, of wearing clothes that fit properly and weren't held together with careful stitching and hope. "Third rule," Ox said, and his voice became even gentler, "you remember that none of this is charity. It's not something you need to earn or pay back or feel bad about accepting. Sometimes people help each other just because it's the right thing to do." This was harder to understand, harder to accept. Molly had lived in a world where every kindness came with a price, where help was always temporary and usually came with conditions that made it feel less like help and more like another form of transaction. But why? She asked again, needing to understand what motivated this stranger to change her entire life with such casual generosity. Ox was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with how to answer, how to explain something that might be difficult for even him to fully understand. "Had a little girl once," he said finally, his voice so low she had to lean closer to hear him. "About your age. Smart as a whip, brave as anything. If she was still—" He stopped, swallowed hard, started again. "If she needed help and I wasn't there to give it, I'd hope someone else would step in." The admission hung between them like a bridge, connecting his loss to her need in a way that made perfect sense, without requiring detailed explanation. Molly understood instinctively that this man's generosity toward her was connected to a grief she couldn't imagine, a wound that had shaped him in ways that made helping her feel necessary rather than optional. "What happened to her?" Molly asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Bad men," Ox replied simply. "Bad men who took away something beautiful from the world." Mrs. Turner reappeared then, carrying towels and a bundle of clothes that looked like they might actually fit a 10-year-old girl. "Come along, dear," she said to Molly. "Let's get you out of those wet things and into something warm and dry. I've got soup heating on the stove and biscuits in the oven." As Molly followed Mrs. Turner toward the stairs, she turned back to look at Ox, who remained kneeling in the same position, watching her go with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something deeper and more complex. "Will you be here when I come back down?" she asked, needing reassurance that this wasn't all some elaborate dream that would dissolve the moment she was out of sight. "I'll be here," Ox promised, and something in his voice made her believe him completely. As Molly disappeared up the stairs with Mrs. Turner, Ox slowly rose to his full height, his joints protesting the movement. Through the window, he could see that the rain was beginning to lighten, and somewhere in the distance, a patch of blue sky was trying to break through the clouds. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest, fragile and tentative, but undeniably real. That night, Molly slept in a real bed for the first time in 3 months. The room was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the town's main street and a wash basin with actual soap that smelled of lavender. The sheets were crisp and white, and the pillow was soft enough that she spent several minutes just pressing her face against it, marveling at the simple luxury of comfort. She had eaten more food in one evening than she typically consumed in 3 days. Mrs. Turner's beef stew had been rich with vegetables and thick with gravy, accompanied by biscuits that were still warm from the oven and butter that melted into golden pools. For dessert, there had been apple pie with cream so fresh it must have come from that morning's milking. But even more nourishing than the food had been the simple human kindness that accompanied it. Mrs. Turner had helped her wash her hair, exclaiming over how pretty it was when clean and properly brushed. She had provided clothes that actually fit, a simple blue dress that had belonged to her own daughter years ago, along with stockings and shoes that were only slightly too large. "You're a lovely child," Mrs. Turner had said while combing out the tangles, and Molly had felt tears spring to her eyes because she couldn't remember the last time someone had called her lovely, or even noticed that she might be. Now, lying in the darkness with a full belly and clean skin and the sound of gentle rain pattering against the window, Molly tried to make sense of what had happened to her. She kept expecting to wake up in the church basement or the stable, to discover that the entire evening had been nothing more than a hunger-induced dream. But the softness of the mattress beneath her and the warmth of the quilts pulled up to her chin insisted on their reality. Downstairs, she could hear the low murmur of voices, Ox talking with the Turners in that quiet, measured way of his. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was reassuring, suggesting plans being made, arrangements being solidified. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without worrying about where she would find her next meal or where she would spend the following night. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of bacon frying in the kitchen below. For a moment she lay still, savoring the sensation of being warm and comfortable and safe. Then she heard Mrs. Turner calling up the stairs that breakfast was ready, and she dressed quickly in her new old clothes and hurried downstairs. Ox was sitting at one of the dining room tables, a cup of coffee steaming beside a plate of eggs and bacon that he had barely touched. When he saw her, he nodded a greeting, and she noticed that he had waited for her before beginning his meal, a small courtesy that somehow meant more than all the grand gestures in the world. "Sleep well?" he asked as she settled into the chair across from him. "Yes, sir," she replied, then added more quietly, "Thank you." Mrs. Turner bustled out of the kitchen carrying a plate piled high with food, more eggs, bacon, fried potatoes and toast, thick with butter and jam. She set it in front of Molly with the satisfaction of someone who found deep pleasure in feeding the underfed. "Now then," she said, "I want you to eat every bit of that. Growing children need proper nutrition, and you've got some catching up to do." Molly looked at the enormous serving, then up at Ox, who made a small gesture that seemed to say, "Eat." She picked up her fork and began, taking small bites at first. then larger ones as her body remembered what it felt like to eat without fear that the food might be taken away. As they ate, other residents of the boarding house began to drift into the dining room. There was Mr. Peterson, a traveling salesman who sold farm equipment to ranchers throughout the territory. Mrs. Caldwell, an elderly widow who had come west to live with her daughter and was waiting for the next stagecoach. A young cowboy named Danny who was recovering from a broken leg and couldn't return to his outfit until it healed properly. Each of them looked curiously at the unlikely pair, the giant stranger and the small orphan girl. But Ox's presence seemed to discourage questions. He acknowledged the other guests with polite nods, but offered no explanations, and something in his manner suggested that none were welcome. After breakfast, Ox announced that he had business to attend to in town, but would return by noon. "Stay here," he told Molly, though not unkindly. "Help Mrs. Turner if she needs it, but mostly just rest and eat and let yourself heal up." When he was gone, Molly found herself both relieved and anxious. Relieved because his imposing presence, while comforting, was also somewhat overwhelming. Anxious because she couldn't quite believe he would actually return, couldn't quite trust that this new reality wouldn't evaporate as quickly as it had appeared. Mrs. Turner seemed to sense her worry. "He'll be back," she said matter-of-factly while clearing the breakfast dishes. "That man doesn't make promises he doesn't intend to keep." "How do you know?" Molly asked, needing reassurance from someone who had no reason to lie to her. 47 years of marriage teaches you to read people," Mrs. Turner replied. "Men who make empty promises have a certain look about them. Shifty eyes, too many words, always trying to convince you of something. Your Mr. Ox isn't like that. He says what he means and means what he says." Molly spent the morning helping with simple tasks around the boarding house, folding laundry, dusting furniture, sweeping the front porch. It felt good to be useful, to contribute something in exchange for the kindness she was receiving. But more than that, it felt normal in a way that her life hadn't felt for months. She was part of a household again, even if temporarily, with routines and expectations and the comfortable rhythm of daily life. True to his word, Ox returned just as the church bell was chiming noon. He carried several packages wrapped in brown paper, which he set on the dining room table before sitting down heavily in his usual chair. "Thought you might need these," he said, pushing the packages toward Molly. She opened them carefully, not wanting to tear the paper that might be useful for other purposes later. The first package contained 2 more dresses, simple but well-made, in colors that would show dirt less readily than the blue one she was wearing. The second held undergarments, stockings, and a warm shawl. The third contained a pair of boots that looked like they would fit properly, along with a small comb and brush set. "They're beautiful," Molly whispered, running her fingers over the fabric of one of the dresses. "But they must have cost so much money." "Money's for spending on things that matter," Ox replied simply. "Can't think of much that matters more than making sure a child has what she needs." It was then that Molly began to cry, not the desperate, frightened tears of someone in pain, but the overwhelming tears of someone who has been carrying too much for too long and finally feels safe enough to set the burden down. She tried to stop, embarrassed by the display of emotion, but Ox simply handed her his handkerchief and waited patiently for the storm to pass. "Thank you," she managed when she could speak again. "I don't know why you're being so kind to me, but thank you." Ox reached into his coat and withdrew something she hadn't seen before, a small leather journal, its pages worn soft with age and use. He opened it carefully, revealing pressed flowers between some of the pages, sketches on others, fragments of text written in a careful hand. "My wife kept this," he said quietly, showing her a page where a child's handwriting had copied out a Bible verse. "Our daughter was learning her letters. She wrote this out for her mother as a present." Molly looked at the careful script, imagining a little girl her own age, working hard to form each letter perfectly, wanting to create something beautiful for someone she loved. "They're both gone now," Ox continued. "Have been for 3 years. But looking at you, seeing you fight so hard to keep your dignity even when you're hungry and scared, it reminds me of her." of the kind of person she might have become if she'd had the chance to grow up. The journal held other treasures: a pressed wildflower, a small sketch of a sunset, a lock of hair tied with ribbon. These were the precious remnants of a life that had been cut short, of love that had been violently ended. "I can't bring them back," Ox said, closing the journal gently. "Can't undo what was done to them, but maybe I can do right by you, and maybe that's something. Maybe that's enough." It was the most he had spoken at one time since Molly had met him, and she understood that she was being trusted with something precious, not just the story of his loss, but the reason behind his kindness toward her. She was not just a random act of charity, but part of something larger, part of his attempt to make meaning from senseless tragedy. "I'll try to be worthy of it," she said solemnly, and meant it with every fiber of her 10-year-old heart. That afternoon, word began to spread through Dry Creek that the stranger had taken the orphan girl under his protection in some official capacity. The reaction was mixed, as reactions tend to be in small towns where everyone has an opinion about everyone else's business. Some, like Pastor Williams and the church ladies, approved of what they saw as Christian charity in action. Others, particularly the men who had been in the saloon the day before, felt vaguely resentful about being made to look callous by comparison to the stranger's generosity. But it was the third group, those who saw opportunity in any change to the established order, who would prove to be the most dangerous. Men like Buck Morrison and Jimmy Fletcher, who had built their sense of self-worth on their ability to dominate those weaker than themselves, found the stranger's intervention deeply threatening to their worldview. If a 10-year-old orphan girl deserved protection and kindness, what did that say about their own behavior? If strength was meant to be used to help rather than to intimidate, what did that make them? These were uncomfortable questions that they preferred not to examine too closely. Far easier to focus their resentment on the outsider who had forced such questions upon them, and on the child whose mere presence seemed to serve as an ongoing reproach to their consciences. By evening, the wheels of small-town gossip and small-town grudges had begun to turn, setting in motion forces that would test both Ox's resolve and Molly's newfound security in ways that neither of them could yet imagine. 3 weeks passed like pages turning in a book Molly had never dared to imagine herself reading. Each morning brought the luxury of waking in a warm bed. Each day, the security of regular meals and clean clothes. Each evening, the comfort of knowing she had a safe place to sleep. The hollow look began to fade from her cheeks, replaced by the healthy glow that comes from proper nourishment and the absence of constant fear. Ox had settled into a routine that seemed to revolve around her well-being. Every morning he would join her for breakfast at Turner's, eating his own simple meal while ensuring she finished every bite of hers. Afterward, they would walk through town together, not aimlessly, but with the deliberate pace of someone conducting business. Though what that business might be was never explained to Molly or anyone else who happened to observe them. During these walks, Ox would point out various aspects of the town that a newcomer might need to know. The safest routes between buildings, which dogs were friendly and which were best avoided, where the doctor lived should she ever need medical attention, how to recognize the signs of weather changing. Practical knowledge, delivered without fanfare, but with the thoroughness of someone who understood that survival often depended on such details. He also began teaching her small skills that he said every person should know: how to tie knots that would hold under pressure, how to read the time by the position of the sun, how to determine if water was safe to drink by observation and smell. Simple things, but presented with a seriousness that suggested they were important lessons, disguised as casual conversation. "Why do I need to know all this?" Molly asked one afternoon as Ox showed her how to identify edible plants that grew wild around the town's edges. "Because knowing things makes you less afraid," Ox replied, watching as she carefully examined the leaves of a plant he had identified as safe to eat. "And being less afraid makes you stronger." It was during one of these educational walks that Molly first noticed they were being watched. Not openly, but with the subtle attention that people pay when they think they're being discreet. Men would pause in their work as they passed. Women would peer from behind curtains. Children would cluster in doorways, whispering among themselves. "They're all looking at us," she observed quietly as they paused outside the general store. "Yes," Ox agreed without apparent concern. "They are. Does it bother you?" Ox considered this question seriously, as he seemed to consider all questions. "People look when they're trying to understand something," he said finally. "Can't blame them for being curious. Strange man comes to town, takes up with local orphan girl, bound to set tongues wagging. But what if they don't like it? What if they try to make you leave?" The question hung between them as they continued their walk, and Molly could see Ox weighing his response carefully. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far worse than small-town disapproval. "Let me worry about that," he said simply. "Your job is to eat your meals, learn what I teach you, and get strong again. Leave the worrying to me." But Molly had learned to read the subtle signs of tension during her months on the street, and she could see that the watching was beginning to take on a different quality. Where once there had been mere curiosity, now there were whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she and Ox approached. Where once there had been polite nods of acknowledgement, now there were averted gazes and hurried departures. The change became most apparent when they visited the general store to purchase supplies. Soap, thread for mending, basic necessities. Mrs. Garrett, the proprietor's wife, had always been coolly polite to Molly during her begging days, occasionally leaving food where the child could find it, but never acknowledging the kindness directly. Now, with Ox's silver coins ready to pay for whatever was needed, her manner had become distinctly chilly. "Will that be all?" she asked curtly as Ox placed his purchases on the counter, her voice suggesting that all would be preferable. "Yes, ma'am," Ox replied evenly, counting out the exact change with careful precision. As they left the store, Molly could hear Mrs. Garrett speaking in urgent whispers to another customer, though the words weren't clear enough to understand. What was clear was the tone, disapproval mixed with something that might have been concern or fear, or both. "She doesn't like us," Molly observed as they walked back toward the boarding house. "She doesn't know us," Ox corrected gently. "There's a difference." That evening, while Molly was helping Mrs. Turner prepare dinner, she overheard a conversation between Jake Turner and another resident of the boarding house, Mr. Peterson, the traveling salesman. They were speaking quietly in the front parlor, but their voices carried into the kitchen where she was peeling potatoes. "I'm just saying, it's unusual," Peterson was saying. "Man like that, taking such an interest in a child who's no relation to him. Makes people wonder what?" Turner's voice was carefully neutral. "Well, what his intentions are. What he's really doing here. Nobody stays in a place like Dry Creek for 3 weeks just passing through. He pays his bills on time and causes no trouble," Turner replied. But there was a note of defensiveness in his voice that suggested he, too, had been thinking about these questions. "I'm not saying he's a bad man," Peterson continued, "but you have to admit it's strange. And there's talk around town that maybe somebody should ask him some direct questions about his business here." Molly's hands stilled on the potato she was peeling, her heart beginning to race. She had heard enough conversations during her time on the streets to recognize the undertones of a community working itself up to take action against someone they considered an outsider. Mrs. Turner, who had been listening to the exchange while kneading bread dough, caught Molly's worried expression and moved closer to the kitchen door. "Evening, gentlemen," she called out cheerfully, her voice loud enough to interrupt the conversation. "Dinner will be ready in about an hour. I hope you've worked up proper appetites." The conversation in the parlor ceased abruptly, and Molly heard the sound of footsteps as the men dispersed to their rooms. Mrs. Turner returned to her bread-making, but Molly could see the tight lines around her eyes that suggested she, too, was concerned about what she had overheard. "Mrs. Turner?" Molly ventured quietly. "Are people really worried about Mr. Ox?" The older woman sighed, her hands working the dough with more force than was strictly necessary. "Some people always worry when things change," she said finally. "And your Mr. Ox has certainly changed things around here. But not in a bad way," Molly protested. "He's been nothing but kind. He hasn't hurt anyone or caused any trouble." "I know that, dear, and you know that," Mrs. Turner replied. "But some folks see a big stranger taking interest in local affairs and they get nervous, especially when that stranger doesn't explain himself much." That night, as Molly lay in her comfortable bed trying to fall asleep, she found herself listening to every sound in the house, every creak of settling timber and whistle of wind through the eaves. For the first time since Ox had taken her under his protection, she felt the cold touch of fear creeping back into her heart. She had been happy. For 3 weeks, she had been genuinely, completely happy in a way she hadn't been since before her parents died. She had felt safe and cared for and valued. But happiness, she was learning, was a fragile thing that could be threatened by forces beyond her control or understanding. The next morning at breakfast, she noticed that Ox seemed more alert than usual, his eyes moving constantly to the windows and door, his responses to casual conversation shorter than normal. When she asked if they would take their usual walk through town, he shook his head. "Think we'll stay closer to home today," he said, and something in his tone discouraged further questions. But staying closer to home didn't prevent the trouble from finding them. Around noon, as Molly was reading in the boarding house's small parlor one of the books from Ox's pack, filled with stories of brave knights and noble quests, she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching on the street outside. Through the window, she could see a group of 5 men dismounting in front of the boarding house. She recognized most of them: Jimmy Fletcher, Buck Morrison, Tom Bradley, and 2 others she knew by sight but not by name. They were dressed in their best clothes, as if attending church or conducting important business. But their faces held an expression that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Ox appeared in the parlor doorway as if he had been expecting this visit, his massive frame filling the space completely. "Stay here," he told Molly quietly. "No matter what happens, you stay right here in this room." She nodded, clutching the book to her chest like a shield, and watched as Ox walked calmly toward the front door to meet whatever was coming. The confrontation she had been dreading for 3 weeks was finally about to begin. The wooden steps of Turner's boarding house creaked under the weight of 5 sets of boots as the delegation climbed toward the front door. Through the parlor window, Molly could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands rested near their weapons, not threatening exactly, but ready. These were men who had come expecting trouble and were prepared to handle it in whatever way seemed necessary. The knock, when it came, was firm but not aggressive. Jake Turner's voice could be heard answering, followed by the low rumble of conversation that was too quiet to make out individual words, but clear enough in its intent. They were asking for Ox, and Turner was telling them where to find him. Molly pressed herself against the window frame, trying to see while remaining hidden, her heart hammering so hard she was certain it could be heard throughout the house. Ox had positioned himself on the front porch. She could see now, standing with his back to the door and his hands visible and relaxed. He looked calm, almost peaceful, but there was something in his posture that reminded her of a coiled spring. Jimmy Fletcher stepped forward as the apparent spokesman for the group, his hat in his hands and his manner attempting diplomacy despite the underlying tension. From her hiding place, Molly could hear most of what was being said, though she had to strain to catch the quieter exchanges. "Afternoon, Mr. Fletcher began, then paused, realizing that despite 3 weeks of the stranger's presence in their town, none of them actually knew his real name. "Afternoon," Ox replied simply, offering no help with the introduction. "Well, that is, some of the men in town, we've been talking, and we thought it might be time for us all to get better acquainted." Fletcher's voice carried the forced joviality of someone trying to make an unpleasant conversation sound social. "I'm listening," Ox said, and the economy of his words seemed to make Fletcher more nervous rather than less. Buck Morrison, apparently deciding that subtlety was taking too long, stepped forward with less diplomatic intentions. Look here, stranger, we don't mean any offense, but folks are starting to wonder what your business is in Dry Creek. You've been here 3 weeks, and nobody knows why you came or when you might be planning to leave. Free country, Ox observed mildly. Man can travel where he pleases. Sure, Morrison agreed quickly, but taking up with local children, that's different. That affects the whole community. At this, Ox's stillness took on a different quality, not the relaxed alertness of a man prepared for conversation, but the absolute motionlessness of a predator deciding whether something constituted a threat. When he spoke, his voice remained quiet, but it carried an edge that made the men on the porch shift uncomfortably. Explain what you mean by that. Tom Bradley, emboldened by the presence of his companions, decided to be more direct. We mean that little girl's been through enough without some stranger filling her head with ideas or making promises he can't keep. She's our responsibility, all of us in this town, and we need to know your intentions toward her. Your responsibility, Ox repeated slowly, and something in the way he said it made even Fletcher look uncomfortable. Where was that responsibility when she was sleeping in stables and begging for scraps? Where was it when grown men were making her bark like a dog for their entertainment? The accusation hung in the air like gunsmoke, and Molly could see the men exchanging glances, recognizing that their moral authority was somewhat compromised by their own past behavior. That's different, Morrison said weakly. We didn't know how bad things were for her. You knew, Ox said with quiet certainty. You all knew. You chose not to see it, because seeing it would have required you to do something about it. Fletcher tried to regain control of the conversation. Look, we're not here to argue about the past. We're here because people are concerned about the present. A grown man, a stranger, taking such interest in a young girl, it doesn't look right. This was the moment Molly had been dreading, when the kindness that had saved her life would be twisted into something ugly by small minds and suspicious hearts. She wanted to run outside, to defend Ox, to tell these men that he had been nothing but gentle and protective and good. But his instructions had been clear. Stay in the room, no matter what happened. Ox's response, when it came, was delivered in a voice so soft that the men had to lean forward to hear him clearly. Are you suggesting I have improper intentions toward that child? The question was simple enough, but it carried implications that made several of the men take involuntary steps backward. There was something in Ox's tone that suggested asking such a question might prove to be a significant mistake. We're not suggesting anything, Fletcher said quickly. We're just asking for some straight answers about who you are and what you're doing here. I'm someone who saw a child in need and chose to help her, Ox replied. If that troubles your consciences, maybe the problem isn't with me. Morrison's face flushed red at this suggestion. Now see here. No, Ox interrupted, and his voice carried such authority that Morrison's mouth snapped shut mid-sentence. You see here? That little girl has been hungry, cold, scared, and alone for months, while you good Christian folk went about your business pretending not to notice. She's been made sport of, humiliated, and treated like an animal by men who should have known better. And now, because someone finally stepped up to do what should have been done long ago, you come here questioning motives. He took a step forward, and despite the fact that he was outnumbered 5-1, it was the delegation that gave ground. I'll tell you what my intentions are, Ox continued, his voice growing harder with each word. I intend to make sure that child gets fed regular meals and sleeps in a warm bed. I intend to make sure she gets treated with the dignity and respect that every human being deserves. I intend to make sure she knows there are adults in this world who can be trusted to do the right thing without expecting anything in return. For how long? Tom Bradley asked, trying to sound reasonable. How long do you intend to stay here playing guardian to our local orphan? It was at this moment that Ox reached into his coat, and every man on the porch tensed, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. But what he withdrew wasn't a gun. It was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft at the creases. You want to know who I am? Ox asked, holding up the document. This is who I am. He unfolded the paper carefully, revealing what appeared to be a photograph, the same one Molly had glimpsed in his leather journal. A woman with kind eyes and a small boy with bright smile, both looking at the camera with expressions of pure happiness. "My wife Sarah and my son Timothy," Ox said, his voice gentler now but somehow more devastating. "Murdered 3 years ago by men who thought their lives didn't matter, men who saw weakness where they should have seen innocence." The silence that followed this revelation was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing, and the wind itself held its breath. "Every day for 3 years I've carried their memory and my failure to protect them," Ox continued. "Every day I've wondered what kind of man I am if I couldn't keep my own family safe. Then I came to this town and saw that little girl, and I realized something. I can't bring back my wife and son, but I can make sure one child doesn't suffer the way they did. I can make sure one innocent life gets the protection and care it deserves." He refolded the photograph carefully, returning it to his coat with the reverence of someone handling something sacred. "So when you ask about my intentions," he said, looking each man in the eye, "they're simple. I intend to be the man I should have been 3 years ago. I intend to stand between that child and anyone or anything that might hurt her. And I intend to do that for as long as she needs it." Fletcher cleared his throat uncomfortably. We didn't know. "About your family doesn't change anything," Ox replied. "Dead is dead, and that little girl still needs looking after." Morrison tried one more approach. "But what about when you leave? What happens to her then? You can't stay here forever." For the first time since the conversation began, Ox's absolute certainty seemed to waver slightly. It was a fair question, and one that had clearly been weighing on his mind. "Don't know yet," he admitted, "but I know she'll be stronger than she is now. Better fed, better clothed, better prepared to take care of herself. And maybe," he looked directly at Fletcher, "maybe by then the good people of this town will remember what Christian charity actually looks like." The delegation stood in uncomfortable silence for several more moments, their original purpose obviously undermined by Ox's revelations. They had come expecting to confront a suspicious stranger with questionable motives. Instead, they had found a grieving father trying to find redemption through an act of simple human kindness. "Well," Fletcher said finally, settling his hat back on his head, "I suppose we understand each other better now." "I suppose we do," Ox agreed. As the 5 men walked back toward their horses, Molly could hear fragments of their conversation, words like tragic and understandable and "maybe we were wrong." But she could also hear other words, harder ones that suggested not everyone in the group was entirely convinced by Ox's explanation. From the window, she watched Ox remain on the porch until the riders were completely out of sight. Only then did he turn and come back into the house, his massive frame somehow seeming smaller than it had before, as if the conversation had taken something out of him. "You can come out now," he called softly toward the parlor, and Molly emerged from her hiding place, still clutching the book, but no longer finding any comfort in its stories of brave knights and noble quests. "Are they going to make you leave?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her heart throughout the entire confrontation. Ox knelt down so that he was at her eye level, his dark gaze meeting hers with complete honesty. "I don't know," he said, "but I promise you this. Whatever happens, I won't leave you unprotected. One way or another, you're going to be all right." It wasn't the absolute reassurance she had hoped for, but it was honest, and somehow that made it more valuable than empty promises would have been. As Ox stood and walked toward the stairs, probably seeking the solitude of his room, Molly remained in the parlor, watching through the window as the sun began to set over Dry Creek. For 3 weeks, she had felt safe and cared for and valued, but now she understood that safety was more fragile than she had imagined, and that even the kindest intentions could be threatened by forces beyond any individual's control. The battle for her future, she realized, had only just begun. The discovery happened by accident, as discoveries often do. Molly had been helping Mrs. Turner with laundry, carrying clean sheets up to the guest rooms when she knocked on the door to Ox's room to see if he had any items that needed washing. When no answer came, she tried the door and found it unlocked. Unusual for a man who seemed careful about such things. She called his name softly as she entered, not wanting to intrude but needing to complete her task. The room was neat and sparse as she had expected, with few personal belongings visible. His clothes hung carefully on wooden pegs, his boots were aligned precisely beside the bed, and his hat rested on the small table by the window. It was when she bent to collect a shirt that had fallen behind the dresser that she saw it. A corner of leather protruding from beneath the loose floorboard near the window. Her fingers found the edge of what felt like a small case or pouch, wedged tightly into the space between the boards. Curiosity, that most human of failings, prompted her to work the object free. It was heavier than she had expected, wrapped in oiled cloth and tied with a leather cord that had been knotted with the kind of precision that spoke of important contents. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it, revealing a leather case that opened to display something that made her heart stop. A badge, silver and worn smooth with age, but unmistakably official. The words, United States Marshal, were engraved around the edge, surrounding an eagle with wings spread wide. Below that, in smaller letters, she could make out Wyoming Territory, and a number that looked like it might be 47. Molly stared at the badge for a long time, her mind trying to process what this discovery meant. Ox wasn't just a drifter passing through town. He wasn't even just a grieving man seeking redemption through kindness to an orphan child. He was a federal lawman, someone with official authority and responsibility, someone whose presence in Dry Creek must have a purpose beyond the personal. The sound of boots on the stairs made her hastily rewrap the badge and shove it back under the floorboard. But not before her fingers had found something else in the hiding place. Folded papers that crinkled like official documents, and what felt like a second gun, smaller than the one she knew he carried openly. Molly. Ox's voice came from the hallway, closer than she had expected. "In here," she called back, trying to keep her voice steady as she stood up with the fallen shirt in her hands. "Mrs. Turner sent me to collect laundry." He appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. For a moment, Molly was certain he would know immediately what she had discovered, but his expression remained calm and unsuspicious. "Find anything that needs washing?" he asked, moving into the room with his usual careful grace. "Just this," she replied, holding up the shirt while desperately hoping her face wasn't betraying her shock and confusion. Tiggs nodded and began gathering a few other items. Socks, another shirt, a handkerchief, while Molly stood frozen near the window. The knowledge of what lay beneath the floorboard burning in her chest like a secret too large to contain. "Something wrong?" Ox asked, noticing her stillness. This was the moment when everything could change. She could pretend ignorance, continue as if nothing had happened, and try to process this information on her own. Or she could confront him directly, demand explanations, and risk destroying the trust that had grown between them over the past 3 weeks. "Why didn't you tell me you're a marshal?" she asked quietly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Ox went very still, his hands pausing in their gathering of laundry. When he looked at her, his expression held no surprise, only a kind of resigned sadness, as if he had been expecting this moment and dreading it in equal measure. "How did you find out?" he asked, his voice carrying no anger, only curious resignation. "The floorboard," she admitted, pointing toward the window. "I was trying to get your shirt and I saw the leather case. I didn't mean to pry, but you did," Ox finished, not unkindly. He moved to the window and knelt down, working the loose board free with practiced efficiency. The hiding place was revealed, not just the badge case, but folded documents, maps, a small notebook, and indeed a second weapon, all carefully wrapped and organized. "Yes," Molly said simply. "I did." Ox sat heavily on the bed, the badge case open in his large hands. "I suppose you want explanations now." "I want to understand," she replied, moving closer but still maintaining a respectful distance. Are you here because of me? Was helping me part of some official business? The pain that crossed Ox's face at this question was genuine and immediate. No, he said firmly. What happened between us, what I've done for you, that has nothing to do with being a marshal. That was real. That was personal. Then why are you here? What's your real business in Dry Creek? Ox was quiet for a long moment, studying the badge, as if it held answers to questions he hadn't fully formed himself. When he spoke, his words came slowly, carefully chosen. There's been cattle rustling throughout this territory for the past year, he said finally. Not just random theft, organized operations, carefully planned, involving people with local knowledge and official connections. Herds disappearing without a trace, brands being altered, animals being sold through channels that shouldn't exist. Molly absorbed this information, trying to understand its implications. And you think someone in Dry Creek is involved? I know someone in Dry Creek is involved, Ox corrected grimly. The evidence points to a network that includes ranchers, businessmen, and at least one law enforcement official. Money changing hands, false documents being created, stolen cattle being moved through this area on their way to markets where no questions get asked. The scope of what he was describing began to sink in. That's why you've been watching everyone. That's why you take those walks through town, why you ask so many questions about local business. Partly, Ox admitted. Though watching you, caring about your welfare, that became more important to me than any investigation. Molly felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that his kindness hadn't been feigned, but also a growing sense of unease about what his presence might mean for both of them. Who do you suspect? She asked. Ox hesitated, then seemed to decide that having revealed this much, he might as well be completely honest. Sheriff Morrison is definitely involved. Too many convenient absences when cattle go missing, too much money for a county sheriff's salary. Buck Morrison, his son, has been spotted in places he shouldn't be, talking to people he claims not to know. And the others. Jimmy Fletcher works for the Rockingham Ranch, owned by a man named McCready, who's been buying cattle at below-market prices and asking no questions about their origin. Tom Bradley runs the livestock auction, where stolen animals get sold with forged papers. The network runs deeper than I initially suspected. The full implications of this revelation hit Molly like a physical blow. The men who came here today, they're all part of it? Most of them, yes, Ox confirmed grimly. Which means they didn't come here out of concern for community morality. They came because they're getting nervous about having a federal marshal in their midst, and they wanted to see how much I knew. Do they know you're a marshal? Not yet, but they're suspicious. My cover story about being a drifter was always temporary. The longer I stay in one place, the more questions get asked. He looked directly at her, his expression serious. Which brings us to the real problem. Molly's stomach clenched. What problem? Originally, my plan was to gather enough evidence to make arrests, then move on to the next assignment. Clean, simple, professional. Ox's voice grew quieter. But that was before I met you. Before I realized I couldn't just walk away and leave you to fend for yourself again. So what does that mean? Ox stood up, moving to the window to look out at the town street below. It means I have a choice to make. I can complete my investigation and arrest the criminals, which will almost certainly blow my cover and require me to leave town quickly. Or I can maintain my cover, forget about the rustling operation, and stay here to continue looking after you. The weight of this dilemma settled between them like a stone. Molly could see that Ox was torn between his professional duty and his personal commitment to her welfare, and she understood that either choice would come with significant consequences. What if they figure out who you are before you decide? She asked. Then the choice gets made for us, Ox replied grimly, and we'll both be in considerable danger. As if to underscore his point, the sound of horses approaching at speed could be heard from the street outside. Ox moved quickly to the window, his body tensing as he counted riders. 8 men, he reported quietly, all armed. All heading this way. Molly joined him at the window. recognizing several of the approaching riders as men who had been in the saloon that first day, men who had participated in various humiliations during her months on the street. "Are they coming for you?" she asked. "Us," Ox corrected, reaching for his gun belt. "They're coming for us." As the riders pulled up in front of Turner's boarding house, Molly realized that the peaceful interlude of the past 3 weeks was about to end violently. The badge hidden beneath the floorboard represented not just Ox's secret identity, but the catalyst for a confrontation that would determine both their fates. The game of cat and mouse was over. Now it was time for the real battle to begin. The riders didn't dismount immediately. Instead, they arranged themselves in a rough semicircle around the front of Turner's boarding house, their horses snorting and pawing the dirt as if sensing the tension that radiated from their riders. From the upstairs window, Ox could see that these weren't the same men who had come earlier for polite conversation. These were harder faces, grimmer expressions, men who had come prepared for violence and were hoping for an excuse to use it. "Stay away from the window," Ox instructed quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "Get your things together, only what you can carry easily. We may need to leave quickly." Molly's hands shook as she tried to follow his instructions, gathering the few possessions that had become precious to her over the past 3 weeks. The new dresses, the books, the small comb and brush set, all symbols of a life she had barely begun to live and might already be losing. "Where would we go?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Depends on how this plays out," Ox replied, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. "But first, we need to know what they want and how much they know." The answer to that question came in the form of Sheriff Morrison's voice, raised loud enough to carry through the boarding house walls. "We know you're in there, Marshal. Come out and let's talk this through like civilized men." The word "Marshal" hung in the air like gunsmoke. Ox's cover was blown completely, which changed everything about their situation. No more pretending to be a simple drifter. No more maintaining the fiction that his interest in Molly was purely personal charity. "How did they find out?" Molly whispered. "Could be any number of ways," Ox replied grimly. "Someone recognized me from another territory. Someone got suspicious and sent telegrams asking questions. Or maybe I made a mistake somewhere along the line." Below them, they could hear the sounds of the boarding house in crisis. Jake Turner's voice raised in alarm and confusion, Mrs. Turner asking urgent questions about what was happening. But the guests moving around nervously, unsure whether to stay in their rooms or evacuate the building entirely. "Marshal!" Morrison called again. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice." Ox moved to the window again, positioning himself where he could see the street without exposing himself to rifle fire. "What do you want, Morrison?" He called back. "I want to discuss your departure from our town," the sheriff replied. "Seems like there's been some misunderstandings about your business here. Time to clear the air." "And the girl?" Ox asked, though Molly could tell from his tone that he already knew the answer wouldn't be one he liked. "The girl's a local matter. Nothing to do with federal business. She stays here where she belongs." The words hit Molly like physical blows. After 3 weeks of safety and care, after beginning to believe that she might have found something resembling a family, she was being reduced once again to a local matter, something to be disposed of according to the convenience of men who had never shown her an ounce of genuine concern. "Not happening," Ox replied. And the flatness of his tone suggested that this point was non-negotiable. "Then we have a problem," Morrison said, and Molly could hear the satisfaction in his voice. This was the answer he had been hoping for, the justification he needed for whatever violence he had already decided to commit. "You have a problem," Ox corrected. "I have a solution." What happened next demonstrated why Ox had earned his reputation as a federal marshal. Moving with speed that seemed impossible for a man his size, he gathered the hidden documents and evidence from beneath the floorboard, stuffing them into a leather satchel that he slung across his shoulder. Then he turned to Molly with an expression that was both gentle and absolutely serious. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, kneeling down so that their faces were level. What's about to happen is going to be dangerous, and I need you to be braver than any 10-year-old should have to be. Can you do that for me?" Molly nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain what she was agreeing to. "There's a window in the back room at the end of the hall," Ox continued. "It opens onto the roof of the kitchen addition. From there you can climb down to the back alley. Mrs. Henderson's house, you remember Mrs. Henderson, is 3 blocks north and 2 blocks west. She may not have been kind to you before, but she's not part of this rustling operation. Tell her what's happening and ask her to send word to the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne. But what about you?" Molly asked, fear making her voice smaller than she intended. "I'm going to keep their attention focused on the front of the building while you get away," Ox replied. "Then I'm going to arrest as many of them as I can and try to break up this cattle operation once and for all." The plan sounded reasonable, even logical. But Molly had lived on the streets long enough to recognize when adults were telling her what she needed to hear rather than what they actually believed. The odds of one man, even a federal marshal, successfully arresting 8 armed criminals were not good. The odds of him surviving the attempt were even worse. "You're not planning to come back, are you?" she said quietly. Ox's hesitation was answer enough. When he spoke, his words were careful, honest, and devastating. "I'm going to try," he said. "But if something happens to me, you'll still be all right. You're stronger now than you were 3 weeks ago. You know how to take care of yourself, and you know there are good people in this world who will help if you ask them." "I don't want you to die for me," Molly whispered, tears beginning to flow despite her efforts to be brave. "I'm not dying for you," Ox replied gently. "I'm living for you. Maybe for the first time in 3 years, I'm living for something that matters more than my own pain." Outside, Sheriff Morrison was losing patience. "Time's up, Marshal. Come out now, or we're coming in." "There's something else," Ox said urgently, pressing a small key into Molly's palm. "If I don't make it, there's a safety deposit box at the bank in Cheyenne. Number 247. Everything in it is yours. Money, documents, things that belong to my family. Enough to give you choices about your future." The generosity of this gesture, combined with what it implied about his expectations for survival, broke something inside Molly that had been holding strong for weeks. She threw her arms around his neck, holding on with the desperate strength of someone who had already lost too much and couldn't bear to lose more. "I love you," she whispered against his shoulder, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "I love you too, little one," Ox replied, and she could hear the thickness in his voice that suggested his own emotions were barely under control. "More than I thought this old heart could love anything again." The moment was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass from downstairs. Someone had thrown a rock through one of the front windows, escalating the situation toward the violence that had seemed inevitable from the beginning. "Go," Ox said, releasing her and standing to his full, imposing height. "Right now, while they're still focused on the front. And remember, no matter what happens, you're going to be all right. You're strong enough to survive anything they can do to you." Molly nodded, clutching the key and her small bundle of possessions, and ran toward the back room as instructed. Behind her, she could hear Ox loading his weapons and preparing for what might very well be the final confrontation of his life. At the back window, she paused for one last look at the man who had saved her life and restored her faith in human kindness. He was standing at the front window now, his massive frame silhouetted against the afternoon light, preparing to face 8-1 odds in order to give her a chance at escape. "Thank you," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her. Then she opened the window and climbed out onto the roof, beginning her journey toward whatever uncertain future awaited her beyond this moment of violence and loss. Below, in the room she had just left, Ox checked his weapons one final time, straightened his shoulders, and walked toward the stairs that would carry him into the most important battle of his life. Not for justice, not for duty, but for the safety of one small girl who had become the daughter of his heart. Ox descended the stairs of Turner's boarding house with the measured pace of a man who had made peace with whatever was about to happen. Each step echoed through the building like a funeral bell, and the other residents had pressed themselves against walls and into doorways, sensing that they were witnessing something far more serious than a simple disagreement. Jake Turner stood near the front door, his face pale with anxiety. "Mr. Ox," he said quietly as the big man reached the bottom of the stairs, "maybe there's another way to handle this. Maybe if you just talk to them." "Time for talking's past," Ox replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had faced similar situations before. "They know who I am now, and they know what I know about their operation. This was always going to end one way or another, but 8 men," Turner began. "I've faced worse odds," Ox said simply. Though whether this was true or merely bravado, even he wasn't entirely certain outside. The voices were growing more impatient, more aggressive. Sheriff Morrison had been joined by his son Buck, and Molly could hear Jimmy Fletcher's distinctive laugh, the same cruel sound that had marked her humiliation in the saloon weeks ago. These were men who had grown comfortable with intimidation and violence, who had built their sense of power on the ability to threaten those weaker than themselves, but they had never faced anyone like Ox. "Last chance, Marshal," Morrison called. "Come out with your hands visible, and maybe we can work something out." Ox moved to the window beside the front door, positioning himself where he could see the street without exposing himself unnecessarily. The sight that greeted him confirmed his worst expectations. 8 men, all armed, positioned strategically around the boarding house. They had blocked both ends of the street with horses and riders, cutting off potential escape routes. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a trap. "What kind of workout did you have in mind, Sheriff?" Ox called back, buying time while he assessed the tactical situation. "Simple," Morrison replied. "You ride out of town today and forget whatever you think you know about local business. In exchange, nobody gets hurt. And the girl? The girl's none of your concern anymore. We'll make sure she's properly looked after." The lie was so blatant, so casually delivered, that it crystallized Ox's resolve completely. These men had no intention of allowing either him or Molly to survive this confrontation. They had too much to lose, too many crimes to cover up, too much money at stake to risk exposure by a federal marshal and a witness who could testify about their true character. "Counter-proposal," Ox said, his voice carrying easily across the street. "You all drop your weapons, submit to arrest, and maybe some of you live to see trial." The laughter that greeted this suggestion was harsh and unpleasant, the kind of sound men make when they believe they hold all the advantages. "I don't think you understand the situation, Marshal," Jimmy Fletcher called out. "You're outnumbered 8-1, with nowhere to run and no help coming. Best thing you can do is surrender now and hope we're feeling merciful." It was at this moment that Molly's small act of bravery changed everything. She had reached the back window and climbed onto the kitchen roof as instructed. But instead of immediately fleeing toward Mrs. Henderson's house, she had paused to look back at the confrontation unfolding in the street. What she saw filled her with a rage that burned away her fear. 8 grown men armed and mounted, preparing to murder the one person who had shown her genuine kindness and protection. Without fully thinking through the consequences, she began to climb back toward the main roof of the boarding house. Her small size and light weight allowed her to move across the shingles without making noise. And within minutes she had reached a position directly above where the confrontation was taking place. The men below were so focused on the front of the building and the threat posed by Ox that none of them thought to look up. This gave Molly the opportunity she needed to execute a plan that was equal parts desperate and brilliant. The boarding house roof sloped sharply toward the street, ending in a gutter system that collected rainwater and channeled it through downspouts to barrels positioned around the building's foundation. These barrels, she had noticed during her walks with Ox, were kept full as a precaution against fire, a common concern in towns built largely of wood and heated with open flames. Working quickly and quietly, Molly began to loosen the metal bracket that held the gutter in place above where several of the riders had positioned themselves. The bracket was old and weathered, held in place more by rust than by structural integrity, and her small fingers were able to work it free after several minutes of careful manipulation. Below her, the confrontation was reaching its climax. Sheriff Morrison had apparently decided that negotiation was pointless and was preparing to order his men to storm the building. "All right, boys," she heard him say, "we tried to do this the civilized way. Time to finish it." It was at this moment, just as the riders began to spur their horses toward the boarding house, that Molly released the loosened gutter section. The effect was spectacular and immediate. Nearly 30 gallons of collected rainwater, along with several feet of heavy metal guttering, crashed down directly onto 3 of the mounted men. Horses reared and screamed, throwing their riders to the ground. The carefully organized attack dissolved into chaos as frightened animals scattered in all directions and men shouted contradictory orders while trying to control their mounts. The distraction was exactly what Ox had been hoping for, though he couldn't have imagined it would come from above. Moving with the speed and precision that had made him an effective lawman, he kicked open the front door of the boarding house and stepped onto the porch with both guns drawn. "U.S. Marshal," he shouted, his voice cutting through the confusion like a blade. "You're all under arrest." Jimmy Fletcher, who had managed to keep his seat despite the chaos, made the mistake of reaching for his weapon. Ox's first shot took him out of the saddle cleanly, the bullet finding its mark with the accuracy that comes from years of practice and absolute necessity. Buck Morrison, dismounted but unhurt from the water deluge, tried to run for cover behind a horse trough. Ox's second shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the dirt, where he lay clutching his wounded arm and cursing creatively. Sheriff Morrison, realizing that his carefully planned ambush had turned into a disaster, made a desperate attempt to restore order. "Kill him!" he screamed at his remaining men. "Kill them both!" But the combination of frightened horses, scattered weapons, and the psychological impact of facing a federal marshal who had just demonstrated his deadly accuracy had broken the cohesion of the attacking force. Instead of a coordinated assault, what followed was a confused melee where men struggled to find cover, control their animals, and return effective fire against an opponent who held every tactical advantage. From her position on the roof, Molly watched in amazement as Ox methodically worked his way through the scattered attackers. He moved with economy and purpose, never wasting a shot, never exposing himself unnecessarily, always thinking 2 steps ahead of his opponents. Tom Bradley tried to circle around behind the boarding house, but found his path blocked by Jake Turner, who had armed himself with a shotgun and was taking an active role in defending his property and guests. 2 other riders attempted to retreat down the main street, but discovered that their escape route was blocked by townspeople who had finally decided which side they were on. Pastor Williams stood in the middle of the street with a rifle, flanked by the blacksmith, the doctor, and several other citizens who had apparently concluded that federal law enforcement deserved their support over local corruption. The tide of battle had turned completely, and Sheriff Morrison found himself facing not just one federal marshal, but an entire community that had awakened to its own moral obligations. The sound that would later be remembered by every resident of Dry Creek was not gunfire or shouting, but the clear, strong ringing of the church bell. Pastor Williams, having positioned himself strategically in the street, had sent his wife running to pull the bell rope with instructions to keep ringing until the fighting stopped. The bell pealed across the town like a call to conscience, and its message was unmistakable. The time for neutrality was over. Citizens who had spent weeks watching and whispering and wondering about the strange giant and the orphan girl now understood that they were witnessing something far more significant than a personal dispute. This was a moment that would define their community's character for generations to come. Sheriff Morrison, bleeding from a grazing wound on his arm and crouched behind an overturned water barrel, found himself in the position he had spent years avoiding: accountability. The federal marshal, standing on the boarding house porch, represented everything Morrison had learned to fear: honest law enforcement, proper investigations, justice that couldn't be bought or intimidated. "Surrender now, Morrison," Ox called out, his voice carrying easily over the continuing chaos. "It's over! Your operation is finished." "Like hell it is," Morrison snarled back, though his voice carried more desperation than conviction. He raised his head enough to take aim at Ox, but found his shot blocked by Mrs. Garrett, who had emerged from the general store with her husband's hunting rifle, and was covering the marshal's position with the grim determination of someone who had finally chosen a side. From her position on the roof, Molly watched the transformation of Dry Creek with amazement. People she had seen every day for months, people who had ignored her suffering, dismissed her needs, looked through her as if she were invisible, were now actively risking their safety to support the man who had protected her. The blacksmith had armed himself with a heavy hammer and was systematically disarming wounded attackers. The doctor was moving between injured men with his medical bag, treating wounds regardless of which side the patient had chosen. Even Mrs. Turner had appeared on the boarding house porch with a rolling pin, prepared to defend her establishment with whatever weapon came to hand. But it was the sight of the children that moved Molly most deeply. Danny Morrison, Buck's younger brother, stood in front of the schoolhouse with tears streaming down his face, shouting at his father to stop shooting, to end the violence, to remember that he was supposed to be the law in this town. Other children had gathered around him, their voices joining his in a chorus that pleaded for sanity over bloodshed. The combination of community pressure and tactical disadvantage was taking its toll on the remaining attackers. 2 had already thrown down their weapons and surrendered to Pastor Williams. Another had been captured trying to escape through the back alleys by a group of townsmen led by Jake Turner. Jimmy Fletcher lay motionless in the street, whether dead or unconscious. Molly couldn't tell. Buck Morrison continued to clutch his wounded shoulder while cursing everyone within hearing distance. The careful organization that had characterized the initial attack had completely dissolved into individual acts of desperation. Sheriff Morrison, recognizing that his position was becoming untenable, made one final desperate gambit. Rising from behind his cover, he pointed his gun not at Ox, but at the boarding house itself. "I'll burn it down," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic and rage. "I'll burn the whole damn place down with everyone in it." It was a bluff. He had no means of starting a fire from his position, and everyone knew it. But the threat revealed the depth of his desperation and the complete abandonment of any pretense to legitimate authority. Ox's response was swift and final. His shot took Morrison center mass, the impact lifting the corrupt sheriff off his feet and dropping him in the dust of the street he had terrorized for years through abuse of his office. The sudden silence that followed was broken only by the continued ringing of the church bell and the sound of weeping children. "It's over," Ox announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the town. "Anyone still armed, drop your weapons now. Anyone wounded, the doctor will see to you. Anyone who wants to surrender and cooperate with a federal investigation, now's your chance." The few remaining members of the rustling operation, those still conscious and mobile, seemed to deflate like punctured balloons. Without Morrison's leadership and facing the united opposition of their own community, they had neither the will nor the means to continue fighting. Within minutes, the street was filled with townspeople emerging from buildings where they had taken shelter. Some came to help with the wounded, others to secure the surrendered criminals. Still others simply to witness the end of an era of corruption and intimidation that had cast a shadow over their community for too long. It was Mrs. Turner who first looked up and spotted Molly on the roof. "There she is," the older woman called out, pointing upward. "Lord have mercy, child. How did you get up there?" All eyes turned toward the boarding house roof, where Molly sat surrounded by pieces of broken gutter, her dress soaked with rainwater, her face streaked with tears and dirt. She looked like a small, bedraggled angel who had intervened in a mortal conflict and somehow tipped the balance toward justice. Ox stared up at her with an expression that mixed relief, pride and gentle exasperation in equal measure. "I thought I told you to go to Mrs. Henderson's house," he called up to her. "I couldn't leave you," Molly called back, her voice small but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "I couldn't let them hurt you." The admission hung in the air like a benediction, a 10-year-old child's declaration of loyalty that had somehow changed the course of a battle between good and evil. Pastor Williams, still holding his rifle, but with tears streaming down his weathered face, was the first to break the emotional silence. "That little girl," he said to no one in particular, "that brave little girl just taught us all what love really looks like." As Ox carefully climbed up to help Molly down from the roof, the townspeople of Dry Creek began the process of reckoning with what they had witnessed. A federal marshal had exposed and broken up a criminal conspiracy that had operated under their noses for years. But more than that, an orphaned child and her unlikely protector had shown them that courage and compassion were choices available to anyone brave enough to make them. The church bell continued to ring, its clear notes carrying across the territory like a proclamation. In Dry Creek, Montana, justice had prevailed, love had triumphed over indifference, and a community had found its conscience in the example of a giant cowboy and a 10-year-old girl who refused to abandon each other when the stakes were highest. The battle was over. Now came the harder work of building something better from the ruins of what had been destroyed. 6 months later, the courthouse in Cheyenne was filled with spectators who had come to witness what the newspapers were calling the most significant corruption trial in territorial history. The evidence that Marshal Ox Brennan had gathered during his investigation in Dry Creek had exposed a cattle-rustling operation that stretched across 3 territories and involved dozens of conspirators at every level of local government and business. But for Molly, sitting in the front row of the gallery, wearing her best dress and holding a set of legal documents that would change her life forever, the trial represented something far more personal than justice served. It represented the final step in a journey that had transformed her from a desperate, starving orphan into something she had never dared to imagine, a daughter. The adoption papers bore official seals and formal language, but their meaning was simple and beautiful. Molly Brennan, daughter of Marshal Ox Brennan, legal and permanent, with all the rights and protections that relationship entailed. She had studied the documents so many times that she could recite them from memory, but she still took them out periodically just to reassure herself that they were real. The house Ox had bought on the outskirts of Dry Creek sat on 5 acres of good land with a view of the mountains that took her breath away every morning when she woke up. It was a modest home, but larger than anything Molly had ever dared to dream of having. Her bedroom had real windows with glass panes and curtains she had sewn herself. The kitchen had a proper stove, and a pantry kept stocked with food. The parlor contained books, dozens of them, and a comfortable chair by the fireplace where Ox would read to her in the evenings. But more precious than any physical comfort was the routine they had built together, the steady rhythm of a family life that provided the security she had craved during those desperate months on the street. Every morning, Ox would make coffee and pancakes while she set the table and fed the chickens they kept in the backyard. Every afternoon, he would review her lessons. She was finally attending school regularly and discovering that she had a quick mind for learning when given the proper opportunity. Every evening, they would sit together and plan the next day, discuss what she had learned, or simply enjoy the comfortable silence that comes when 2 people know they belong together. The townspeople of Dry Creek had undergone their own transformation in the months following the confrontation. The exposure of the corruption that had operated under their noses for years had prompted a period of community soul-searching that resulted in new leadership, new businesses, and a new commitment to taking care of their most vulnerable residents. Pastor Williams had organized a committee to ensure that no child in Dry Creek would ever again face the kind of neglect and abandonment that Molly had endured. Mrs. Turner had opened her boarding house to traveling families who needed temporary shelter. Even Mrs. Garrett had softened her approach to customers, particularly those who were struggling financially or dealing with difficult circumstances. The change was most evident in how people treated strangers. Where once newcomers had been viewed with suspicion and wariness, now they were welcomed with the kind of hospitality that frontier communities were supposed to provide. The lesson of Ox and Molly, that outsiders might bring gifts rather than threats, had been absorbed by a town determined to never again ignore suffering that occurred within their midst. On this particular afternoon, as autumn painted the mountain slopes in brilliant colors and the first hints of winter touched the evening air, Molly sat on the front porch of their home, working on her arithmetic, while Ox repaired a section of fence that had been damaged during the previous week's windstorm. It was the kind of peaceful domestic scene that she had once believed existed only in storybooks. The sound of a wagon approaching on the road caused both of them to look up. It was unusual for them to have visitors unannounced, though not unwelcome. As the wagon drew closer, Molly could see that it carried a family, a man and woman with 2 small children. Their belongings packed in boxes and bundles that suggested they were traveling with everything they owned. The wagon pulled to a stop in front of their gate, and the man climbed down with the careful movements of someone who had been traveling for a long time. He was thin and weathered, with the look of someone who had been working hard but not eating regularly. The woman remained on the wagon seat, holding a baby, while a small boy clung to her skirts with the wariness that children develop when they've learned not to trust strangers. "Excuse me?" the man called out, removing his hat respectfully. "We're looking for Dry Creek. Been told there might be work there for folks willing to do an honest day's labor." Ox set down his tools and walked toward the fence, his massive frame causing the stranger to take an involuntary step backward. But when he spoke, his voice carried the same gentleness that had first convinced Molly to trust him. "You're close," Ox said. "Dry Creek's about 2 miles down this road. But it's getting late, and you've got little ones there. Why don't you folks plan to spend the night here? We've got room, and my daughter can help your wife with the children while you rest up." The offer of hospitality to complete strangers was made so naturally, so automatically, that the traveling family seemed stunned by its generosity. The man looked from Ox to Molly and back again, clearly trying to process an act of kindness that exceeded his recent experience with human nature. That's very generous of you," he stammered. "But we don't have money to pay for lodging, and we don't want to impose on—" "No imposition," Ox interrupted gently. "And no payment expected. Just neighbors helping neighbors." Molly felt her heart swell with pride as she watched her father, extend the same compassion to this struggling family that he had once shown to her. The circle of kindness that had begun with his decision to share a meal with a starving orphan was expanding outward, touching new lives, creating new possibilities for human connection and care. As the family accepted their invitation and began to unload their few possessions, Molly noticed that the small boy was staring at her with the same mixture of hope and wariness that she remembered feeling during her first encounter with Ox. She knelt down to his level, smiling in what she hoped was a reassuring way. "Are you hungry?" she asked quietly, recognizing the hollow look around his eyes that came from too many missed meals. The boy nodded, too overcome to speak. "Come on then," Molly said, taking his small hand in hers. "Let's get you something to eat. We've got fresh bread and milk that's still warm from this morning's milking." As she led the child toward the house, Molly caught Ox watching her with an expression of profound satisfaction. In that moment, she understood that their story had come full circle. The love and protection she had received was now something she could give to others, and the cycle of compassion would continue expanding outward like ripples on a pond. That evening, as they sat around their dinner table with their unexpected guests, sharing food and stories and the simple pleasure of human companionship, Molly reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago she had been alone, hungry, and convinced that the world held nothing for her but cruelty and indifference. Now she was part of a family, part of a community, part of a story that had taught an entire town the difference between looking away from suffering and stepping forward to address it. She was no longer the orphan girl who had begged for scraps and endured humiliation. She was Molly Brennan, daughter of a federal marshal, student friend, and living proof that love could triumph over the hardest circumstances when people were brave enough to act on their better impulses. As Ox tucked her into bed that night, following the ritual they had established during their first weeks together, Molly looked up at the man who had transformed her entire world with 7 simple words. "Thank you," she said quietly, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "For what?" Ox asked, though his gentle smile suggested he knew the answer. "For seeing me," Molly replied. "For choosing to help when everyone else chose to look away. For making me part of your family." Ox was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight and something deeper, the peace that comes from finding purpose in service to others. "Thank you for letting me," he said finally, "for teaching me that love doesn't end with loss. It just finds new ways to grow." Outside their window, the lights of Dry Creek twinkled in the distance, marking a community that had learned to be worthy of the trust placed in it. And in the small bedroom of a modest house on the edge of town, a man who had lost everything and a girl who had been given up for lost, settled into the comfortable routine of a family that had been forged in adversity and strengthened by the simple decision to care for one another. The story that had begun with laughter and cruelty had ended with love and redemption. And in the morning, there would be new opportunities to extend that same grace to others who needed it most.